Hello, my name is Cécile Shea, and I am a non-resident senior fellow in diplomacy and security at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Welcome to our second Rapid Response Live concerning the Gaza ceasefire and where we stand. In Chicago, it is Tuesday afternoon, 3:15, the 14th of October. Things changed so quickly, I think I needed to explain to you exactly where we were speaking from at this moment. We are hoping today to hear from our two extremely qualified guests on how they think the ceasefire has progressed this far, what the risks are to the future, and is there some sort of route to a more lasting peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis, starting with this peace agreement. For those of you with questions, I invite you to log on to ccga.live, ccga.live, where you can post questions. I will be able to see them from this end, and we'll try to spend the last 5 minutes referring to some of your questions. Our guests today are, first of all, Ambassador Dan Shapiro, native son of Illinois. Ambassador Shapiro was the U.S. ambassador to Israel from 2011 to 2017. The prime minister throughout that entire period was Benjamin Netanyahu, so he has some experience dealing with the current prime minister. Besides his ambassadorship, Dan held senior positions at the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the National Security Council. He also spent about 10 years on Capitol Hill as a staffer, both on the House side and on the Senate side, focused on foreign policy issues. Currently, Ambassador Shapiro is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he joins us from Washington, D.C., the Atlantic Council today. Also joining us, and we are so happy to have her here, is Dr. Lisa Anderson, the Dean Emerita at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Anderson joined the faculty of Columbia in 1986, and she continues to lecture there as a professor emerita. Her specialty includes democratization and nation building in the Middle East. So obviously her expertise is very timely when we're talking about Gaza. From 2008 to 2016, Dr. Anderson was the provost and then the president of the American University of Cairo. That was the period of the Egyptian Revolution, the deposing of Hosni Mubarak, who had been in charge for many decades by that point, and the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood, brief though it was, I think it was 18 months or so of when they were in charge of the Egyptian government. So, of course, the Hamas was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood originally, so she will have, I'm sure, a lot to say about the peace process today. Let me open by asking both of you, if you could, just to give me a staccato answer of the odds that you would give that the ceasefire will still be in effect 6 weeks from now. So far in the last 4 days, we've had a pretty good 4 days until about 2 hours ago. The Israeli hostages who were still alive were turned over to their families. Very heartwarming moment. About 2,000 Palestinians have been returned to their families, including quite a number of them who had been serving life sentences in Israel. And then today we've hit a roadblock of the anticipated 20 or so remains of hostages who died in captivity. It looks like only 4 were turned over, and which may cause some retaliation from the Israelis. So I will say that until 2 hours ago, I was like at 40% sure that the ceasefire would hold on Friday. But then over the weekend, I got more optimistic and thought the odds were 60%. So I'm going to stick for now with 60% chance that the ceasefire will still be in effect 6 weeks from now. So I don't know. Let's start with Ambassador Shapiro. What odds do you give this thing of holding together for at least a while?
Thanks for having me, and it's great to be with the Chicago Council and with Dr. Anderson. I'd give the odds a little higher, probably 75, 80% that it can hold 6 weeks, and I'd even suggest a bit longer than that. I mean, into the months ahead. At least if we're comparing it to the kind of conflict that we've been observing for the last 2 years, which has been so dreadful for everybody involved. I think the key factor, frankly, is the President Trump factor. You know, he made it very clear he wanted this to happen. It was a big change for most of this year, once he took office, he was quite accommodating of various Israeli decisions that added time to the conflict and didn't seem to advance the hostage release. Then after the Israeli failed assassination attempt of the Hamas leaders in Doha, Qatar, and kind of seeing the war come to the Gulf and to partners that he's concerned about there, he really made a turn, and very quickly, using the UN General Assembly meetings with Arab and Muslim leaders, then his visit with Prime Minister Netanyahu, he sort of announced a deal and willed it to being, even though most people hadn't agreed on the details of the deal. But no one would quite say no to him, not Netanyahu, and the Qataris and Turks helped bring Hamas along with the hostage releases. And so he, as then, of course, on his visit to the region, described it in very grandiose terms. This is the beginning of a big Middle East peace. Well, it's not that, but it shows that there's a strong investment, and people who are trying to stay on his good side, which is most people, will have an incentive not to cross him as far as that goes. There's also a broader exhaustion that I think set in, which helped contribute to the end of the war. Neither side got everything that they had insisted on in previous ceasefire negotiations. And there will probably be flare-ups, operations here and there. We, of course, have seen already violence, Hamas perpetrating against other Palestinians to try to settle scores and things. So I don't think we should expect this to be completely quiet, but I don't think we're going to see us go back to this full-scale conflict in that period of time.
Okay, so I'm at 60%. Dan is at 75%, or maybe even higher. Dr. Anderson, what's your view on how the chances of this ceasefire holding?
I think it depends a little bit, and Dan suggested this, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation, on how you define ceasefire. I think there will be a lot of flare-ups, actually. I'm not that optimistic. Certainly compared to what's been going on for the last 2 years, there will be far less violence in the Gaza Strip than there has been for the last 2 years. And I think that's certainly better. But I'm not optimistic at all that there aren't going to be provocations all over the place for when people feel like they don't want to have to be sitting on their hands. They're frustrated. They're unhappy that nothing more has happened, so forth and so on. So I think there will be flare-ups, but I actually think they will accumulate to a sort of slow, simmering unhappiness and violence that couldn't really be qualified as a ceasefire. So I think I'm, pretty low on the percentage scale.
Yeah. Are there things, so the next question, and we'll start with Dr. Anderson on this one, what can the administration do to make it more likely that the ceasefire holds and possibly even moves forward to something that could be good for everybody concerned, both the Israelis and the Gazans? Dan said on CBS News yesterday or the day before that he thought the next step had to be demilitarizing Hamas, and that's going to be pretty difficult. So what do you think the president and the administration should be doing, not just to make sure that full-scale war doesn't break out again, but also to giving this process a real chance of success?
Well, I think, as everyone has remarked, clearly the fact that President Trump decided he was going to own this made a huge difference. People pay attention to the American president. And so I think from that point of view, if you could imagine a continuation of that kind of attention to this, people will continue to pay attention to what the American president wants to do and wants them to be doing. I don't think that there's a very clear roadmap, if you will, to what the next phases are supposed to be, how it's supposed to work out, which means all the more that the American president, and not just his envoys, not just other people who have been involved in these conversations, but the president himself has to be on top of this. If he's not, then I think there will be ample opportunity for people to be able to say, well, my interpretation of what the president meant was this, and that's different from what your interpretation of what the president meant, and so forth and so on. So I think he has an enormous amount of leverage, as he's already demonstrated. And if he continues to exercise that, both with the Israelis, with the Egyptians, with the Qataris, with the representatives of Hamas that are, involved, I think there's, opportunity here. I'm not, again, particularly optimistic that given all the other things he's got on his agenda, that this is going to be something that he's going to be able to give the kind of time and attention to that he has over the last few weeks.
I was particularly struck by the fact that he has now committed the U.S. to all sorts of things, from helping to get the aid in to helping to rebuild Gaza. And we don't have an agency that does that sort of thing anymore. So, Dan, how are we going to accomplish, everything from helping to put together a multinational force of observers of some sort to helping Gaza to rebuild with kind of without a lot of our own infrastructure that is still available to work on these things? Or am I just being a retired Foreign Service officer who overemphasizes my value to our society?
No, you're not overemphasizing something that has definitely been damaged and significantly downgraded since the administration took office. All of these, there are real opportunities coming out of this war. Obviously, you've got to consolidate the ceasefire and everything, but the opportunities to get the region back on a path of regional integration and to capitalize on the damage done to the Iranian axis of resistance, Iran and its terrorist proxies through Israeli and U.S. military power, requires diplomacy, requires development, requires trade, requires investments in technology and in people. And these are all aspects of U.S. government infrastructure that have been downgraded or been depopulated by some of our best experts in the first 9 months of the administration. So it's a handicap. Now, the president has put a lot of his own personal stake in this deal that he announced, and he announced it in very grandiose terms. And, it's credit to him and his team that they were able to get that done. But the team is very thin. They need a lot more people. They need a lot more expertise. And it's not clear how quickly they will be able to draw on that. Now, you mentioned I put focus on the disarmament of Hamas as really the key element of the phase two. And I do think that's critical. And I think the key levers for that are Qatar and Turkey, who were the countries with serious influence on Hamas that kind of brought them to do these full hostage releases, who are going to have to use that same influence on the disarmament. And then, of course, some of it's going to have to come from bottom up, from Palestinians, who I think many of them don't want to live under Hamas's rule, which has brought so much tragedy to their lives. So that combination is critically important. But it's also the key. If you cannot get disarmament underway, and the threat of Hamas against Israel from Gaza and the threat of Hamas continuing to suppress the Palestinians in Gaza persists, it's going to be very difficult to do all the other good things that are outlined in phase two of the plan. Getting a multinational international stabilization force in, getting major investment in reconstruction from the Gulf to the tune of tens of billions of dollars, getting the Palestinian Authority to establish itself with the elements of governance in Gaza, and even starting those discussions between Israelis and Palestinians about their political horizon, which the plan says should include a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. Without disarmament of Hamas, none of those are going to happen, and this is going to look a lot like every previous round in Gaza, in which the seeds are sown for the next round because Hamas is still there, slowly but surely clinging to power and preparing and arming up for the next round.
Dr. Anderson, do you see pressure points on Hamas to help them or to
I honestly actually don't even know how that would happen. So we can all want disarmament of anybody.
Yeah.
I don't know who's going to be doing the gun buyback programs or whatever the mechanism for doing this is. So, it's all well and good to say that that's essential, but if that's essential and we have no clear, on the ground daily, this is how it's going to happen. It's not going to be because the Turks decide that, Hamas should disarm. There has to be a process for this, a mechanism for this. So it's not, I don't see us, and this gets to your question earlier about whether the United States, or for that matter, anybody else, actually has the administrative, technical capacity to do a lot of the things that we say need to be done, should be done, so forth. I don't see how that's going to happen. I just, are the Egyptians going to be going in and taking guns out of people's hands? I don't see how it's going to happen. The Hamas, as we know, are not going to wake up tomorrow morning and say, okay, we're going to give up all of our weapons. So that's not going to happen. So there has to be some way, even if everyone in the world thinks that the pressure ought to be exerted, to have that realized in practice. And I don't see how that's been visualized.
And, I was involved in a weapons buyback program in another country. And it was like 20 years after the end of hostilities, and we were still buying back shoulder-mounted, ground-to-air missiles, and not handguns. Pretty major weapons, and having to blow up large amounts of armaments, and it's a huge job. And I do think that money might help buying back some of the weapons, but then there's the question of where do all those people go, and this is where the lack of details in this agreement was. Hamas members can leave if they want, or they can stay if they want. Okay, if they want to leave, where do they go? This was one of my questions as I read this plan. Is if 10,000 people all wanted to leave, where do they all go? All right. So I hear what both of you are saying, which is, the president got us this far, so good for him. He seems to now understand that as much as he may want to not be involved in foreign conflicts, he is involved in the Middle East. Can we have more forward momentum as long as Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister? Would a change of government in Israel make it easier for us to move forward on not just the various phases of the ceasefire, but possibly towards some kind of political settlement down the line? Dan, what do you think?
I think the fact of getting to this point was partially enabled by the dynamic between Trump and Netanyahu. I mentioned that once Trump made that turn after the Doha strikes, Netanyahu really did not have any ability to resist his demands. He has tied his own political identity and standing so closely to Trump. And you could see some of that dynamic during the president's short visit in Israel. So that actually, I think, was a facilitator. But then there was that question of whether or not the prime minister would accompany him to the summit in Sharm el-Sheikh. There was an invitation quickly proffered from President Cécile in Egypt, apparently accepted, and then shortly thereafter the prime minister pulled it down. One version was because a Jewish holiday was starting last night and he wouldn't make it back in time. Another version was that his own political base would rebel against him having to be on a stage with President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, who was there, who they don't recognize as a peace partner and don't want to have any discussions about a Palestinian state with. And a third version was that it was other countries who were coming to the summit, Erdogan from Turkey, the Pakistanis, the Iraqis, countries that have no relations or poor relations with Israel, that were not ready to be on a stage with Netanyahu. So even to get to some of those broader regional opportunities of expanding the circle of integration, certainly to get on to the beginnings of discussions with Palestinians about a political horizon, it's difficult with this government, which is not just Netanyahu, but it's dominated and it's certainly dependent on the most extreme elements of Israeli politics, people who are not just against two states, but they're for full annexation of the West Bank and even of Gaza, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So a change of government is going to be helpful in various respects. We don't know exactly when the Israeli election will land, sometime in 2026. It could be as late as October. It could be earlier in the year. And, that's going to be interesting and important. One of the challenges, I think, that election campaign itself will present is that the prime minister will probably make one of his key arguments to the Israeli public who do you trust not to allow a Palestinian state to come into being? The idea of a Palestinian state was declining in support in Israel before October 7th, but it's cratered, of course, after, as most Israelis find that to be too risky of a prospect. And if we're going to get on the road to that political horizon discussion, which is in the president's 20-point plan, to have a credible pathway to a Palestinian state, it's going to take longer and it's going to look different than previous efforts. It's not a copy-paste of the Oslo Accords, but you have to engage the Israeli public. And if the prime minister during that election campaign every day is saying, I'm not going to let it happen, I'm not going to let it happen, and even his opposition may say the same to match him, that's going to be a cast a pall over the atmosphere that would make it easier for Arab states to play the parts we want them to play in the various other aspects of the plan, reconstruction, disarmament, and so on.
And especially since it seemed like President Trump was endorsing President and Prime Minister Netanyahu during one of his off-the-cuff remarks during his speech at the Knesset the other day. Dr. Anderson, there's something I've been thinking about a lot, and so we're going to switch tacks a little bit to draw upon your expertise. This idea that started in Israel 2 years ago and is now seemingly codified of using the Gulf states to establish some kind of new government in Gaza and build some kind of new political entity in Gaza. You know, I saw what the Saudis did in other countries with their provision of textbooks to the schools and with their training of the clerics. And, what are we doing by letting some of these other countries now establish what I think people would hope would be some sort of secular government in the country? Where do you fall on this?
Well, first of all, I think it's not clear to me why, what the carrot is for the Gulf states to do anything in Gaza. Right now, they didn't break it. They don't have to fix it. So unless there's some rationale for anyone being involved, and again, this is something President Trump can do if he wants to do it, but he's going to have to lean in and do it. So that's one thing. It's not, there's been, for almost a year, a lot of, the Egyptians could do this and the Saudis could pay for that and so forth and so on. There's, somebody's going to have to decide that the reason why anyone would do anything is that they would get something out of it. So what are they going to get out of it? It's not clear to me in any event what the reason why anyone should be involved. It's a mess. It's why get involved in that unless there's something advantageous to you. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, to your question specifically, there's no love lost between the governments of the Gulf or Egypt or, for at this point, anybody for the sort of underlying curricular support for religious government and so forth and so on. Everybody has had it with the Muslim Brotherhood. Everybody has had it with Hamas as that kind of ideological. So you could imagine there being textbooks that were quite nationalist, for example, but they're not going to be religious. Nobody is doing that anymore. That turned out to have been something where everybody got their fingers burned. And so, it does seem to me that there's a lot that Egypt or Gulf countries could offer here in terms of financing, construction, experience, big infrastructure development, so forth and so on. There's a lot that could be done, education, rebuilding hospitals, so forth and so on. I don't see why they should do it at this point. It's going to be expensive and difficult, and they're not going to get any credit for it unless beforehand we have some deal that's worked out that they do get something for it. So at this point, I don't think the religious issues are going to be important, but I do think all the rest of why anybody should do it is still on the table.
And those are very small countries without experience in doing this sort of thing. So, yeah.
I think that Saudi Arabia has some pretty big construction companies. They could do a lot.
I was leaving the Saudis out, but yes, they could.
Yes.
The rebuilding part, I agree they could do. I'm more thinking about the human side, the building of the human capital. But
yeah, I wouldn't underestimate.
In terms of
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, Dan.
Go ahead, Dan.
No, I'm sorry, Lisa. I was just going to say, in terms of the incentivization, for them to lean in and fulfill these roles. It's true, and I think Lisa's right, that just sort of their own interests as you look at the region might be to sit on the sidelines and not take responsibility. Of course, they've said that they want to see various things happen for Palestinians, and they may also connect it to their broader vision of a regional integrated community of moderate countries. But the incentives generally have come from the United States, and this is where President Trump's penchant for very transactional deal making maybe holds some promise. It's not the sort of traditional way of foreign policy always, but we saw him do it in the first term with the Abraham Accords, where the UAE got initial approval for the F-35s, didn't actually end up happening, but Morocco got the recognition of Western Sahara. More recently in this episode, Qatar got a security guarantee, at least in an executive order. Turkey got an F-35 approval and the suspension of an investigation of a Turkish bank. That's been very controversial. So the president is willing, it seems, to wheel and deal, and it's conceivable, and there may be other interests affected by this, for better and worse, but it's conceivable he could put chips on the table that get these countries incentivized to do things that otherwise they would rather just sit on the sidelines for.
So we have 5 minutes. So all of the questions coming into CCGA Live are concerning the loss of Israeli reputation in the United States, declining poll numbers, which are very much shown in the council's own polling. We see what's going on in college campuses, including Dr. Anderson's. One thing that hasn't been discussed that I've seen is a lot of frustration in the Jewish community that people don't talk about out loud, but you see, especially with young Jewish people, of really, sometimes coming to loggerheads with some of the older guard. So what is has Israel understood yet how much damage they have done here? Because I get the feeling that sometimes they don't understand what has happened in the U.S. And what is the future of the U.S.-Israel relationship, given what we're seeing in polling and in attitudes among young people? So how about if I give each of you 90 seconds? Does that work? Dr. Anderson, could you start? Because you're right there in the eye of the storm in Columbia.
Well, I mean, I do think that this partly goes back to who is going to be the government in Israel. And if the debate is going to be in an election who is going to be more hardline against the Palestinians, that's going to be read in the United States as a government of Israel that is not interested in peace, not interested in, accommodating the interests and needs and so forth of the Palestinian people, or more broadly interested in being part of it's in its own way of a moderate region. So I do think that, there has been enormous disaffection. I think that's not necessarily, baked in, but I do think that if these are the kinds of rhetorical positions and electoral campaigns and so forth that we see in Israel in the next year, it is going to bake in, actually. It is going to be something where people say this is not a country that supports human rights, that is, the kind of country that the United States has historically seen as an ally and an asset. So I do think that this is going to be, an important debate in the United States over the course of the next year or two.
And as one of the questioners points out, this could also fracture MAGA, right? Because you already see a split there in viewpoints toward Israel. Dan will give you the last word on this.
Yeah, I spent some time in Israel recently, and I do think there is an awareness, but maybe not a fulsome awareness, as they've been so consumed by their own situation, particularly before these hostages were released. But there's awareness of the slippage, and yes, people focus on what's happening in the Democratic Party, but as you mentioned, there's certainly something happening on the other side as well. And so there's going to be work to do, right? So the first issue was to end the war, not to have the kind of the daily drumbeat of the suffering that war produces. Then I do think it's true. The face of Israel and the leadership and how that's presented, whether it's this prime minister or a different prime minister, but maybe a different coalition. Certainly, if you have people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich prominent in presenting Israel's case or presenting Israel's face, that's not going to help rebuild that. But I think over time, trying to get back on the road toward a resumption of the path of integration between Israel and moderate Arab states. Embedded within that, discussions between Israel and Palestinians about a legitimate political horizon where Palestinians can have their needs met. And again, it may look different from the earlier models of two states that we worked on. I think that's a big part of this. And in having that discussion, we should also bear in mind the way the security partnership between Israel and the United States does benefit U.S. interests and influence in the region. Yeah. Our ability to work together over this last year or 2 years has actually significantly advanced our interests in downgrading the capabilities of the axis of resistance that Iran and its proxies present, and building that coalition of moderates that Israel is linked to with UAE, the Saudi Arabia, as well as Egypt and Jordan and others, is another way that U.S. influence in the region is actually advanced. And so we want to try not to, even as we try to address certain concerns with the relationship, lose what's valuable in the relationship and even persists to be valuable to this day.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Lisa Anderson, Dean Emerita, Professor Emerita for Columbia University, Ambassador Dan Shapiro coming to us from the Atlantic Council. Thank you both. I've learned a lot from this time, and if you'll agree, we'd love to have you back in the future as hopefully things continue to improve in Israel and Palestine. Blessings to both of you, and a happy holiday to those of you who are celebrating. Bye-bye.